Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video for Sabaton history. And continuing on doing the Sabaton history videos that I've already watched the music videos for until we're caught up. Today we're going to take a look at Attack of the Dead Men. I'm excited about this one because this is one of my favorite of their songs that they've done so far. I love the story. I just think it's a really cool story and fits perfectly with their genre of music. If you want to have a say in future reactions that I do, whether it's to Sabaton or even just future historical content in general that I do on the channel. Right now over on Patreon, we've got our current vote going on for anybody who's a patron at any level. And you can see the 4 choices that I'm asking folks to vote between. And also next week, I am going to be getting out of the house a little bit. I'm going to be making a visit up to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio, which has a number of graves of historical significance. I'll be doing a vlog from there. So if you have other areas in Western PA, West Virginia, Eastern Ohio that you'd like me to get to, I'd certainly welcome to do. You're welcome to ask about that. And when I get to traveling again, I will certainly be doing far more than that. But let's go ahead and dive into this one. And I'll welcome your comments, your questions, your observations at the end. Use that comment section below. Make sure you hit like if you haven't already. Let's see what they have to say about this one.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Per from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History. There are a lot of legendary tales that came out of the Great War.
Yeah, and the song Attack of the Dead Men talks about one of the most legendary.
And the strangest.
Yeah.
And the most legendary.
Yeah, but the strangest.
And maybe most legendary.
Yeah, that's fair.
Osowiec Fortress was built in the late 19th century on a strategic hotspot near the river Biebrze in what is now Poland, but back then was the Russian Empire. It was just about 50 kilometers away from East Prussia, though, along the important railway line from Bialystok to Königsberg, which conveniently ran straight through the fortress. So it's kind of obvious why this was quite a headache for German high command in the Great War. This close to the German border, and effectively controlling one of the few railway lines through all the bogs and marshes in the area, the fortress had to either be taken or destroyed. Otherwise, it would prevent any advance into northern Poland. In fact, the Germans had tried to take the fortress back in September 1914 and again in February 1915, where the second attack had severely damaged much of the fortress defenses through heavy bombing. But the main defensive ring had nonetheless held long enough for the Russian counterattacks to force the attackers to break off.
So let's just talk real quick about the background of the early stages of the Great War as it was then known. Germany's plan all along, knowing it was going to be fighting a two-front war in the West with the French and the British and others, and in the East with the Russians, was what was called the Schlieffen Plan. And I know a lot of folks are familiar with that already, but if you're not, the idea was this, that they couldn't sustain long-term a two-front war. So they needed to be able to win one quickly. And so the idea was quickly hit France with everything you've got, knock them out of the war, and then rush as many divisions as possible to the east to fight Russia, because Russia is a huge country and it's going to take a long time for it to mobilize divisions and get them to the front. So they figured they'd have time to knock France out in a couple of weeks and then get over there to fight. Well, neither thing worked out. The attack against France, which went through Belgium, which brought the British into the war to kind of bypass the defenses, got bogged down not far from Paris, and Russia mobilized far faster than German high command thought that they would. So instantly, this kind of turned into a really bad situation for the Germans on both fronts.
By the summer of 1915, though, the Kaiser's army was determined to try again. Now, August von Mackensen's Gorlice-Tarnów offensive that summer had thrown much of the Russian forces on the Eastern Front off balance, and German and Austro-Hungarian forces advanced on a wide front eastwards. Seeing their chance, German high command wanted to also take Poland in a frontal attack and ordered Generalfeldmarschall Paul von Hindenburg on the offensive. Osowiec Fortress was an important prize to take from the weakened Russian army. So 12 German infantry battalions, accompanied by up to 30 heavy artillery pieces, set their sights on Osowiec. The corps of the Russian defenders under General Lieutenant Berezovsky's command was made up of around 500 men from the 226th Infantry Regiment Zemlyansky,
Not many.
supported by several hundred militia. They dug in several lines of defenses and redoubts, trying to give the German artillery as small a target as possible. But once the assault began, much of the fortress walls, barracks, and towers began to crack under the heavy German siege artillery. But artillery alone won't take the fortress.
So it's again interesting here. We're talking about a 19th century fort. It was built with 19th century artillery in mind, and so it probably wasn't built to sustain the heavy artillery that was available by the time of the First World War. And it's interesting too that there were so few defenders available, because when you think of Russia, you think of massive amounts of manpower, and you figure Germany's divided on two fronts. It's surprising to me that Russia had so few men available to defend such a strategic location.
They would still need the infantry for that job, and the Russians had enough machine guns and defensive works to make that very difficult and very costly. The Germans, though, brought in a fairly new and extremely dangerous weapon: gas. Now, gas warfare was fairly new. In 1914, the French had used tear gas, and in early 1915, the Germans had first used poison gas at Bolimov, though that failed. Since then, however, it had had a devastating effect on the totally unprepared and ill-equipped Russian soldiers, who died gruesome and horrible deaths in the deadly clouds of gas.
Yeah, so, we hear a lot about gas warfare during World War I. It's one of the things people think of, trenches and gas. But largely on the Western Front, the gas did not have I wouldn't say it didn't have an impact, but it didn't have a significant impact on the war in the West. It was used, but both armies pretty quickly got equipped for that. Like he's saying, though, wasn't the case in the East, especially for the Russians.
Without gas masks to protect themselves, the defenders of Osowiec were expected to suffer the same fate. In the early morning of August 6th, as the winds were finally favorable, the German gas batteries opened up. A dark green smog descended upon the battered defensive works. The wave of gas crept over the Russian lines, creating a death zone. The gas used was made out of a mixture of chlorine and bromine. While the bromine acted as a respiratory irritant, the chlorine attacked the lungs, chemically burning them, right? The chlorine attached itself to moisture in the air, turning it to hydrochloric acid, which then bit into the membranes and flesh of the lungs, aggressively dissolving the soft tissue. The Russian soldiers were literally choking on their own blood, as every breath they took destroyed their lungs.
And I've actually read that in some cases they were actually coughing up pieces of their lungs that were actually coming out. You can just imagine how awful that was. I mean, we all know the destructive power of hydrochloric acid. Imagine your own body forming it inside your lungs. How brutal that must have been.
Unable to breathe, they died in agony, coughing out bloody lumps of their own lungs.
There it is, yeah.
But it was not only the lungs that suffered, as the acid attacked the soft tissues of the eyes and noses, burning them chemically as well.
Oh, my goodness.
The soldiers burned from the inside out.
Oh.
Many died within the first few minutes. Those further away from the initial attack tried binding wet rags and urine-soaked shirts around their faces in a desperate attempt to protect themselves, but that often helped little. Everything the wave of gas came in contact with began to die. Leaves and grass turned yellow and black. It killed the insects and the animals in the woods. There was no escaping, as the gas crept into every ditch and into every hole, even attaching itself to the brass of guns and shells.
Brutal.
The defenders suffered heavy losses, and whole companies in the foremost trenches were simply wiped out. Only around 100 men in the defensive lines further back survived, still terribly burned. As the gas dissipated, the German infantry battalions formed up. While other units went to secure the railway line, it was up to these 7,000 men of the German 76th Landwehr Division to storm the main defensive lines in front of the fortress. Confident that most of the defenders had been wiped out and that the few left would be overcome with ease, the German infantry moved onwards.
So, here I'm thinking, if I'm the Germans, I'm confident too. 7,000 men attacking what you think is an empty fort at this point. Even if every one of those men on the Russian side had survived, they were still vastly outnumbered. There were only a couple hundred of them to begin with. So it should have been an easy job to overwhelm and take this fort.
First lines were indeed littered with only the dead, grotesquely deformed in their final moments of inevitable death. The end. Or was it? As the German troops moved onward over the shelled-out ground, they suddenly came under heavy fire. The fortress artillery opened up on them, and machine gun fire tore holes in their ranks. Further out on the flanks, the last Russian reserve companies coming up from the rear formed to counterattack the German infantry. Seeing those friendly reinforcements rush in with their bayonets attached, the 100-odd survivors in the trenches also emerged. Bayonets fixed, they stumbled like zombies out of their dugouts, crawling and limping their way into the open. Complete shock stopped the German attackers dead in their tracks. Like dead men returning to life, the Russian survivors came on, heavily breathing, gasping for air through destroyed lungs, their faces scarred by chemical burns, half hidden with bloody rags. They marched on, thirsting for revenge for the terrible fate thrust upon them. Their tears were bloody. Their eyes burned red. They spat blood and parts of their lungs as they advanced, croaking and coughing like the living dead. This horrible sight, as well as the unexpected counterattack, halted the Germans, and a deep panic set in. They hastily withdrew, soon running away in terror as the panic spread through their ranks, pushing their comrades aside, trampling over each other, stumbling over barbed wire as Russian artillery shells fell in between them. The attack of the dead men came on, accompanied by a bayonet charge of the reserves, and recaptured the lost trenches. By 11 a.m., a few hours after the deadly gas attack, the defensive lines were back in Russian control. The Germans had withdrawn back to their own starting positions.
So, yeah, he briefly mentioned the barbed wire that they ran into. So these 7,000 Germans, however many were left at this point, were in such a panic when they ran that they didn't even bother to run back to their starting locations. They just ran anywhere they could, and they were actually running right into their own defensive lines and their own barbed wire and just getting torn up by that. That's how psychologically distraught these guys were. Never underestimate the power of psychological warfare. This is should have been an easy German victory, and that sight must have so horrified them to the point where it caused them to lose. I'm really curious to know, and I don't know if he'll mention it, if any of those original defenders of that 100 men actually survived the war.
Okay, much of the battle remains shrouded in legends and mystery, and that is likely to remain so. The casualty numbers on either side are unknown, as are the German records of this battle, though it was certainly a well-deserved tactical victory of a small Russian force over a much larger German force. Strategically, it did little to preserve the Russian hold on Poland, and Osowiec Fortress had to be given up weeks later as it was too damaged and the whole front had to pull back anyhow. And since, after the Russian revolutions of 1917, this war was viewed by the Soviet Union as a capitalist war and a source of shame. It was largely edited or written out in their history books. Nowadays, post-Soviet Union, however, the legend of the attack of the dead men is gaining more attention as Russia's interest in the Great War increases. And the legend is certainly a tale worth telling. That is beyond dispute.
So just a little further background, if you did want to ever visit Poland and visit the Osowiec Fortress, it is right here in northeastern Poland, not too far from the Lithuanian and Russian or Belarusian borders. And you can kind of see here, I'm going to zoom it in a little bit and then go to the 3D version of it, and you can kind of see what it looks like today. This is just something I thought was pretty interesting, but there you have the area there. And I couldn't find any information on whether or not any of the initial defenders that were part of that attack of the dead men actually survived. So maybe somebody else knows a source where you can point that out. And if you do, use that comment section below and let us know. If you have additional information to what we've already discussed about this battle or about that part of World War I in general, would love to hear it. Use that comment section below. Let's have a conversation. Join us over on Discord or over on Patreon as well, and we continue it there. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.